Welcome to the Exhorter podcast, where our aim is to stir up love and good works through bite-sized biblical discussion. I'm here this episode with John and Kyle, and my name is Paul, and we have an interesting topic here with real practical implications. Kyle, what are we talking about today?
Sodom. Did that get your attention?
Just a little.
We're going to talk about the influences that the world has on us, but we're going to look at a story in the Bible that centers around Lot's choice to move his family towards Sodom and place himself in that environment. So what we're really going to focus on today is about the decisions we make that impact our children primarily, regarding what influences we have around them. Now, this is on my mind because about a year and a half ago, I made a choice to move my family from Boise, Idaho to Fresno, California. And I've been scratching my head the last year and a half wondering, am I making the same mistake as Lot? But all joking aside, it's really a good story.
Because it's California, or?
Well, a lot of people question my sanity because you're supposed to move from California, or you're supposed to flee California to a haven like Idaho.
Sure.
Is the way most people have it worked out in their minds.
You know that it's been in the last 10, 15 years, there have been multiple times where you weren't in Idaho and you said, one of these days, we all need to move to Idaho, build a compound and live there because it's just the best place to be. You finally got there and then you left. So I get the...
Somehow you prevailed in this one. You dragged me back to California and I couldn't pull you out. So in Genesis 13, that's the story I want to center on in this episode today. In Genesis chapter 13, where we've been introduced to Abraham. I'm going to say Abraham. Of course, if you're reading in your Bible, you'll see Abram. He hasn't really changed his name yet, but I'm going to say Abraham because that's how we all know him. It's just simpler that way. We've been introduced to Abraham, his wife Sarah, the fact that they don't have any children, but his nephew Lot comes along with them. And you would think of Lot as the presumptive heir to Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, God calls them to go to the land of Canaan, says, "This is the place I'm going to give to your descendants in a few generations." But then famine happens and they decide to go to Egypt instead because there was apparently more food or more opportunity in Egypt. And that was disastrous. And so at the end of Genesis chapter 12, they come right back to Bethel and Ai, the place where they started at the beginning of Genesis 12, and they begin to have some success. Abraham's flocks grow, and his resources and possessions and wealth grows, as does his nephew Lot, to the point where they're having a hard time coexisting together because they have such large flocks. And so they make this decision that we need to separate a little bit. We need to go different directions so we have room to grow and expand. Now, what happens in Genesis chapter 13 is that Abraham presents Lot with a choice. So around verse 8, he says to Lot, "Please, let there be no strife between you and me, between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please, separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. That's a parenthetical in the Bible, by the way. And that's your first warning that this is not a good choice. That's your first warning that something ominous is looming. So in verse 11, Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. So not a really good choice on his part. And you might be looking at this and wondering, is Abraham basically giving Lot the first choice? Would Abraham have gone to Sodom if Lot chose differently? There's a little bit of a quirk happening here, if I'm understanding correct. Left to right, that's how Abraham puts it. You can go to the left, you can go to the right. And Lot chooses east. See, when we think of a map, what's the top of the map?
North.
It's north. That's how we think of it. My understanding is that east was probably the top, how they would reckon the top. So left and right would be north and south. If you look at a map of the promised land in the days of Abraham, just take it and do a quarter turn to the left, 90 degrees counterclockwise, and you'll see what's being offered here. Abraham is not saying, Lot, you can choose the promised land that God promised to me and my descendants, or you can choose the other land that's not what God promised. Or if you take this one, then I'll take the land not promised. That's not what Abraham's offering, I don't think. I think he's saying go north or south. But either way, there's plenty of room in the promised land for both of us. And Lot, not walking by faith, which is the promised land and all that God promised as future blessings, he chooses to walk by sight. And he sees the plains of the Jordan. He sees Sodom and Gomorrah in that area, that it's well watered. Now you recall in the previous chapter, there was drought, there was famine. Maybe he's thinking, and he's thinking for himself, again, walking by sight, not by faith. And he's thinking, I want to go somewhere where that doesn't happen again. And that looks like the right place to go, even though we're given all the warning signs here that the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. So he's definitely making a choice that is negative. And this brings up some good questions. I mean, how important is it where we choose to live? So as husbands, as fathers, we have some responsibility for our families and the kind of positions we put them in to either hopefully succeed spiritually. How important do you think it is to think about where we choose to live?
Well, I would preface an answer by saying that I'm not going to name a city and say, don't live here because it's like Sodom. I won't do that. But I will say I've seen situations where people have made a choice and they made comments like this. There is no church there, but we're gonna form one. I'm gonna go there and our family's gonna start it, and it's gonna be great. And I can think of at least one situation where it's someone related to me that it did not end well. He is no longer a believer, and nor is any of his family. They basically were influenced the other way, and it didn't end well. When you send your kids to college, you got a same kind of thing. You're thinking about how strong is there a good, strong local church. And these days, it's not just that. We have a lot of churches that are dying, and I don't want to say don't go there, but you've got to go there with an attitude of God first, because you could go there as a family and help restart or reinvigorate a church that's dying. There's a lot of good things that can be done. But if that's not foremost in your mind, like the first thing you think of, I've got a job opportunity in X city or X location, the first thing you're thinking about is, what will that do to me and my family spiritually? Is that good or is that bad? And if you don't start with that, I think you could be in a bad place. It doesn't mean it's going to end bad, but that should be the very first thing as husbands and fathers that we're thinking about.
Yeah, I think Abraham would have been more up to that task than Lot, right? I think he was a lot stronger. I think that probably takes that self-reflection to look at you and your family, and are you on the path of being a strong influence on other people and studying and growing a church and evangelism, or are you just making it through yourself? Are you needing a place to help grow you and to grow your family and teach your family? I think you need to take some look at yourself.
Well, and I mean, ultimately, you can see the impact this has on his family. And when you read forward a few chapters into Genesis, we were given the warnings here. Now, of course, Genesis was probably written by Moses after the fact. So that little parenthetical about this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom, and the little note about, well, they were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord, that was written after the fact. So we all know that Sodom was not a good choice for Lot. It was not a place that was really conducive, the right environment for raising godly-minded children. And we see that I'm convinced it begins to impact the way he thinks. When we get to Genesis 19, it's one of those stories in the Bible that we don't really like to dwell on too much. But you have the two angels that show up to Sodom because God is determined to destroy them. They become irredeemably sinful, and they won't listen anymore, and they continue in sin. These two angels show up. They appear as just men, and the men of Sodom show up and say, Lot, bring out these men. We want to get to know them. And of course, know is a very strong euphemistic term for something much more devious and sinful. I always roll my eyes when people suggest, no, they just, it's like the Chamber of Commerce welcoming group. They just wanted to have a warm, well, then how does that make sense with what Lot says just a few verses later in Genesis 19 in verse 8, he says, see now, I have two daughters who have not known a man. You get the drift and what the euphemistic interpretation of no is by that verse. I have two daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof. So when I was younger, I used to look at the story with an attitude like I needed to be an apologist for Lot. Try and find a way to defend his actions here.
There's no defense for this.
It's indefensible, especially now that I have 2 daughters of my own. And I just think, what got into Lot? I guess you could pull out of this that there's the good intention there that he's trying to protect his guests. But that's still a long ways off from justifying. And it just sounds to me like this is what happened when Lot chose to move to Sodom. It started to pervert the way he thought about right and wrong. And now offering his 2 daughters to this crowd to do whatever they want with them seems like a good idea to him.
I mean, the best resolution to that situation was not to be there in the first place, let alone defend them all. That would have been a lot better.
Now, of course, the story gets even worse if you keep reading in Genesis 19. After Lot's wife is turned to a pillar of salt, and they barely escape the fire that rains down from the skies and destroys these cities from the map. They're in a cave, and his 2 daughters think, there's no one left. We have to repopulate the earth, so let's get our own father drunk, and let's get pregnant by our own father. And again, you have to look at that and think, why does someone make a decision like that? Well, consider the environment they were raised in and how it maybe perverted their way of thinking about things. That getting your own father drunk to have him impregnate you seems like a good choice. So you see the cascading effect of Lot choosing. It looked by his sight like a good and prosperous place to live. He wasn't thinking about the Lord first. And so, Paul, I think your earlier comment is right on the nose. I mean, really, it's not so much about geography, especially with the way the internet works. Sodom is not necessarily a physical place anymore. It's everywhere. It has so many points of access into our life through phones, computers, television, everywhere. It's about just the influence that we allow in the world around us and whether we make our choices by sight or by faith.
So, Kyle, I know you're not talking about the choices of where we live necessarily being the be all end all. It's really every choice we make, not just where we live, but it may be the job that we choose that takes us away from our families or influences us negatively or other things, correct?
Right. Yeah. And despite my attempt at humor at the beginning of this episode about moving to California, that really was a thought in my mind. But when I considered the church, when I considered the environment, when I considered the work that needs to be done in this area, I understood that I wasn't making this choice the same way Lot was making his choice. I think most importantly, if you're thinking about moving somewhere, it needs to be more a question of why am I doing this? What's my motivation? No matter where you live, the influence of Sodom is there.
So the message is don't move to Pergamum because that's where Satan dwells.
Exactly.
Okay, we've established that. Okay.
But again, you might look at California as a place, we got to get out of here. But just because you leave California, or just because you leave somewhere that you think maybe has those bad influences, are you going to find somewhere where the temptation to sin isn't there? Are you going to, just by changing your geography, are you going to find a place where your kids won't stumble across something on the internet that you don't want them to see? Or are you going to find somewhere where they won't have bad influences at school?
So there is no place like that. That's a good point. You're not going to find a city or a state that you get away from that. But I think the better point could be you could pick a city. I'll say San Francisco. We tend to think of San Francisco as being as far left and sinful a place in this state. You know, when you it may not be, but we think of it that way because of what it stands for. But if there were a community of Christians there that were actually spreading the gospel and doing good, and you could go there with your family and be part of that and be rejuvenated, and mainly knowing that you as the leader of your family, and I know when I say that I'm talking to husbands and fathers, but also mothers and wives, thinking about yourself, that you've got to make sure you're going to remain strong and you've got a support system for your family too. You could be in a place that is not morally sound around you, but that's pretty much everywhere. But if you've got a strong church that you know you can count on, or at least you've got a part in, I think that for me, that's a big part of the decision is there a strong church that I can join that's doing good, that's sound, that I know will help when I'm dead and gone. It'll help with my children.
Just like we were talking about with Abraham and Lot, you're going to have to look at yourself. You're going to have to do some self-reflection to see if you are an influencer or if you are influenced. Are you the type
I'm a social media influencer. By the way.
Are you the type that are going to be a good tool for evangelism in that place? Because if you're not there, there's going to be no conversion in that area. I mean, we need people who are strong. That's why we all need to develop our faith and develop our knowledge and ability to evangelize, because we can't just abandon San Francisco or a place that needs the gospel. Our main focus as Christians is to go into the world and spread God's word. So yeah, everyone needs to take an account for their abilities and whether they can, dwell within a certain congregation or build that. And I would say one of the largest factors I look at is I'm going to want to make sure that my family is secure and strong, and they are not going to be influenced in a negative way. And that's kind of how I would make my decision of whether I would stay in a congregation or stay in a location that has those negative influences.
So as husbands, as fathers, heads of families, what are we doing? What should we be doing to limit the influence so that we don't make the same mistake? Let's start with television. We all have different kids of different ages. Mm-hmm. John and I have some kids around the same age. His oldest son is older than my oldest daughter, so he's a little further along. Paul has some teenagers and some kids in his 20s too, so he's got a little bit older group of kids. Television. What do you guys do to safeguard, to not place your family within the realm of Sodom when it comes to television? What do you do to safeguard that?
It seems weird, but actually streaming has been a blessing in some cases. I say that because commercials on regular TV, you don't really have control over what comes up and what, engage your kids. But when you deal with a streaming, platform, you have a password or you have, parental controls, and you can kind of lock it down in a certain way. You have a lot more control as a parent about what your kids can see using certain platforms. And
right. You need to be in the know.
Yeah.
You need to know what's going on. We've all seen the videos of Disney executives, their leaked meetings about their not so secret agenda.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to screen, you need to know what your kids are watching. But I agree with you. Streaming is a really good way to control that or keep an eye on it. At the end of the day, you've got to know what's coming into your house through the television. Another good thing about streaming is usually you can also see what has been watched. There's a section.
There's no anonymity about that.
Most platforms have recently viewed, and some of them you can't even erase it, so it's there to be seen. So it's not like your kids can watch something and then hide, cover their tracks. So that's another thing I like about streaming. What do you guys think about letting your kids have a television in their room? Is that inviting too much risk, or is there a way to police that and be careful with that?
It's like having a computer in the room and having any devices in the rooms. I think the only time we've ever done it, there was no internet connection, and it was with a DVD player, or if it was with, an Xbox with no online connection type thing. But most of the time we try to keep those things out in general, because you can get stuck in that room for too long, distractions. But then again, you have to set those best practices. Paul, you turned me on to VidAngel. That was a great service. I've been enjoying that. I use it as an adult mostly, just so that there's no foul language spilling out. There's nothing questionable coming on to a show that may not be a bad show, but just they find ways of, throwing some stuff in there. So there are resources out there, different resources. What have you been using that for a while? But
yeah, I would say to both of you, when your kids are younger, it's easier, and the reason it's easier is because most of the movies your kids are watching are G-rated anyway. And I know that doesn't mean anything these days because they're putting, hidden agendas, Kyle, as you were referring to, into the movies. But when they get older, it gets more difficult because some of the movies they're watching have a lot more overt stuff right in there. But I would say this, for me, I've had to do a gut check myself to say, what am I watching? Or what are we as parents watching? And are we sending a consistent message if we're being really strict with the kids, but then we choose to watch something else? So that's number one. If you're a parent listening to this, check yourself. How can you tell your kids to watch it if you're not doing the same? They see that and they see right through it, and they will, follow and do what you do. I have used services like VidAngel, and for those who don't know what that is, it's if you got streaming services like Netflix, Amazon, any of them really, VidAngel just kind of sits on top of it. You subscribe. It's a small fee per month. You stream through it. And for most movies, you can see everything that's in the movie, but also you can just say, I don't want any of that. Click, and they will mute any profanity. If there's going to be a scene with any sexuality or anything and you want to get that out of there. But he gets down to every detail, which, by the way, is kind of surprising sometimes because I've gone back to movies that I've watched in the past and I'll look at the filter and it will show, here's how many of this word, here's how many of this word. And I literally didn't recall that it was that bad until I looked at what was in the movie.
Well, and I can't be the only one that's recommended a movie to someone, but it's a movie that I've only ever seen the TV edit of.
I did that dating a girl and her dad was an elder and we all watched it as a family and I picked the movie. It was a very uncomfortable moment sitting there watching it going, oh, I forgot about this and I forgot about that. But Kyle, you mentioned something else. So one of them is access. So if you don't have one of those streaming services like VidAngel, parents, before you have your kids watch something, get online, whether it be IMDb or whether it be a Christian website that shows you what's in the movie.
IMDb, which is Internet Movie Database. It's an app, or just go imdb.com and you can find the parental guide or the content. And they'll tell you exactly, as far as language, how many of each of the naughty words, the bad language words that are in there. They'll tell you exactly what kind of explicit material in there. So really, you're without excuse.
Yeah, or there's a Christian one. One's called movieguide.org, and that's more Christian based, and it tells you what's in every movie. But that's one thing. But Kyle, you mentioned something else about TVs in rooms, and I almost feel like that's in some ways yesterday's issue, because everybody has, if your kid has a phone and you let them take that phone in the room with the door closed or overnight, you're giving them a TV with access to unlimited, really, unless you got strict restrictions on your phone. That is really today's issue, is how you're restricting access to these things on cell phones. And that's where our kids are really getting most of the access. It's not on the TV, it's on their phone. We
pushed off that topic for a few years by giving my son a smart watch, like a gizmo, I think it is. There's no internet to it, but we can track him and he can call us, and it's a one-way connection, and so no one else can talk to him. And there are a lot of kids age 10 with cell phones in school. I will be pushing that off as far as I can, getting them a phone and what that looks like.
I think the point, though, Kyle, you're making is you wouldn't go move to Sodom without really thinking, researching what's going to happen to my family if I go there. Well, if we give our kids access to unlimited content on a device, you're kind of doing that.
Right.
If you're not watching it, if you're not controlling it, you're giving them unlimited access to many sinful things that may be influencing them more than you know. And it's not just the videos, it's the social media component as well.
Right. And that's how I'm trying to take the story of Lot moving to Sodom and apply it to us today. Phones, that's the place I wanted to go next, because kids have questions. Young kids have millions of questions. Teenagers get curious. And you know what happens when your kids are young? They ask you question after question after question until you're about ready to pull your own hair out. But I imagine as they get to be teenagers, for some reason, they stop wanting to ask questions. They still have the questions, but maybe they just don't ask you as often. Where do you think they're going for answers?
My kids know how to search. they know how to search streaming platforms, but they know how to search YouTube now. They know how to search Amazon. They're always looking for toys on Amazon. When it comes to a point in time when they get older, I'm assuming, Paul, it would be really easy for them to just edge you out of that conversation and just go look for those answers themselves, right?
There is. And so that's another reason that getting access to services where you can actually look at what's their browsing history? What are they searching? Limiting what they have access to on their phones. And there's not just on your operating device, but there's services you can buy to limit that. In our house, the rule is that you cannot take your phone in your room unless we'll make exceptions. Sometimes they're listening to music, doing their homework, and they'll ask. But every night, those phones get put on my nightstand. And they're right next to me, so I can review them. Londa can look at them. And when they come and get them, they got to come in our room to get them. Does that mean that everything's solved? No. It's frankly, even now, it takes a lot of time to go through. Have we seen issues? It's been less. I don't let our kids on social media yet, and I'm not saying that's the be all end all. If your kids are on social media as teenagers, because everybody's doing it. I've tried to push that as far as I can because I see very little good coming from it. So right now, my teenagers going up to senior. None of them have social media because that would add exponentially the number of things that I'm having to review. But it didn't protect them from everything. There was some texting, some group chats with some friends that were bad influences that we had to get involved with, things like that. So there's so many channels. And I knew it to be true, but I don't realize just how much until my teenagers had cell phones and how much work it is. But as parents, if you're not paying attention to that, if you're just sitting in the back seat and they're doing the driving and you never look, then I think you're in for a rude awakening as to the things that they may be accessing that you have no idea.
Well, and that's exactly the point I wanted to make in this episode today is that's the equivalent of Lot pitching his tents as far as Sodom. When you allow those influences right into your home, right into your children's hands on their phones and on their screens, but don't have any control. Maybe you can't completely 100% control every aspect of it, but if you don't have any control, if you don't have any awareness, you're pitching your tents in Sodom and you're inviting that kind of influence into your family. And I think you're failing to be the leader you need to be.
As my kids are getting older, there are so many little questions that I just never really thought about to ask. Sleepovers, events at schools, whether they can go over to their friend's house from school, that I don't know. There's so many of these questions that come up in 4th, 5th, 6th grade that you're not really ready for. And you think you have the right mentality about by guarding their minds and their hearts. But you're going to have to make a decision on those, and
you remember the days when you were changing diapers a dozen times a day and you're thinking, I can't wait to get past this. And now that my youngest is just about potty trained and I really don't do that anymore, I'm facing these same kinds of questions you are about sleepovers and what level of freedom do I give them? And I'm kind of thinking, I wish I could go back to diapers. That was a bit easier. That was very straightforward.
And I think for those of you who are listening, you can't put your kids in a bubble. And that's not the message here. You want to train them to make good decisions. And I know we brought up this passage in prior episodes, but Deuteronomy 6, beginning in verse 6, when it talks about, these words, which I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to take your sons and shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. If you're monitoring what they're doing, and you're on top of that. And it's not just the social media. It's not just the phones. It's not just the TV. It's what they're doing at school every day. It's what they're learning. And so as parents, if you're not active doing that and sitting down and making sure every influence, the kids at school that are telling them something, the teacher that showed a video that you didn't even know had some messaging that now they're asking some questions. If you're not sitting down and creating those moments, and I don't mean distracted moments when you're doing something else, but really focused moments, then Kyle, back to your original verse, you're really doing the same thing. You really have no idea what's happening to them that you need to be engaged in.
Right. At my phase right now with a 3 and a 7-year-old, they want to tell me everything. When I get home, they want to tell me everything that happened in that day. I imagine it's a little different with your teenagers. They're not as willing to tell you everything. You might need to ask them a few questions. And I think that's where a lot of parents struggle to make that effort. But it is the essential step that guards you from the influences of this world.
I'm sure you have a mix though, Paul. I can imagine your girls. I imagine one just not saying anything and one just telling you everything.
I do. Yeah. I do have a mix. And there's times I'm distracted as I walk in the door. But the other thing is, and if you've got more than one child, which we all do, making a time for that one-on-one time, because they may have something to say they don't want to talk about in front of the other. And so for me, that some of my best moments have been taking one of them for a walk or just getting some time alone to really hear, hey, what's going on?
So if I could just summarize some of the things we've talked about today and give you, the audience, something to take away and apply as parents in your own houses, I think it's the idea of being proactive. It's the idea of taking ownership, taking charge, and thinking through your decisions before they are made. So I want to ask each of you, what is being a proactive parent? What does that look like to you?
Well, Kyle, we've already talked about some practical things to do, but I'll just start with this. I know at the beginning of the episode, we were talking about Lot and the decision made, and we kind of shifted to, his family. But I want to go back even just to yourselves, because you may be listening to this and you're not a parent. And, I go back to Matthew 6:33 about seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness. You can't replace yourself doing it every day and making it God being number one in your life, whether you're a parent, a husband, or you're single. and you make sure that every decision you make, that is at the forefront. And I think if you just remember that in every decision you make, you'll be okay. And your kids will see right through it if you're not doing that. So if you're a parent and you bring in all these tools we talked about, you screen everything, but then you and your wife are watching content that your kids watch and see you're watching and realize, oh, they're really not serious about this. They're going to see right through it. So we need to be consistent. And I would say some of our young people who have left the church when they get older, and I've talked to some of them, I've read studies, why do they leave? And there's many reasons, but one of them is what they see as hypocrisy in the church, or maybe even their own family, of people who say they believe these things, but they're not doing these things. And so to me, being proactive is first being proactive about yourself. You can't be proactive about your kids if you're not doing it yourself. Your kids will see right through it, and you'll really not be as effective as you should be. So to me, that's the most important point.
Right. And I think that applies to everything, even your career choices. And that's the biggest failing of Lot. If you want to look at his fundamental failure, he was walking by sight and not by faith. He looked at the plains of the Jordan. He looked at Sodom. He looked at that area and said, that looks good to me, and I'm going to trust my own assessment of the situation and make a decision based upon what I think is best. He wasn't putting God first. And I think in every aspect of our jobs, if we're choosing a career path that takes us away from home, and we could probably find another job, maybe it pays less, but we're home more. But if you're away from the family because you put career first, hey, career is important, but is it more important than your kids? Is it more important? Because if you're away at work all the time, how are you going to be there to monitor your kids, to watch over your kids? So in our career choices, and even in the place where we live, our involvement with the church, everything, we need to show that put God first.
Yeah, my mind goes to righteous living starts with righteous thinking. And being proactive to me makes me think about Philippians 4:8. Whatever's true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable, think on these things. I know that's subjective. That's different for every household and every person. But I think it's really important for leaders, fathers, parents to sit and think about what's their definition of that in their household. How are they going to start molding those minds? Because if you can start building their conscience, building the way that they think about things, then they can at least process this world through God's righteousness, through God's word. And I want to make sure that they're processing all these things through when they're thinking about all these influences, that they're running it through the right type of conscience that we've helped them build. So I think that's the first one, but I think it has to be identified. You can't just assume, and you really need to sit down there and think, maybe even write it on the wall, of your house, what we value, what we think, how we view this world.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is exactly what Joshua said, that a man defines the tone of his family. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua wasn't afraid to stand up and speak for, here's what happens in my house. Here's the tone that I have set in my family. And it sounds like that's what you're describing a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's important for the kids that you have that conversation really early, that our house is going to look different than your friends does. Even in the church, I mean, it's going to look a little different, and it's really okay that your friends' parents have different rules for their household. We have different rules. And they've seen that when we talk about words that are bad words or words you can't say. Is that a bad word, or is that just a not nice word? Are there these different definitions? Everyone has them. And so I think that's when we first started talking about our house is going to look a little differently than other people's, and that's okay.
Yeah, and so at the end of the day, I think being proactive is really the key, and it can take a lot of different shapes or forms. There is no one-size-fits-all manual for parenting. Your kids are going to be different from my kids. One of my kids is going to be different from my other kid. So you just have to do your best, and I think being proactive is the best way to do it. You're going to react at times. Yeah. There'll be situations that catch you off guard, and you'll need to react, and you'll need to give a good response. But as much as you can, be proactive. Have the conversations with them. Yeah, there's going to be some awkward conversations. There's conversations I'm not looking forward to. to. I'm tempted to just say to my wife, look, we have daughters, so you have those talks with them. I'm off the hook. But as parents, we got to be proactive there. Yeah, too early is too early. You want to protect their innocence, but there reaches a point in time and you just got to decide for yourself and how well you know your children when that time is. But I'd rather an awkward talk come from me than one of my kids decide to seek out answers by asking Siri or looking on their phone. I'd rather get out ahead of that and frame it the way you talked about, John. I'd rather frame it my way, defining what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. So being proactive with those conversations, be proactive. We already talked about content that we allow in the house. Screen what your kids watch. You got to know what your kids are listening to. You got to have those conversations. If they stop asking you questions as they grow older, I mean, maybe you don't want to pester them, but you got to ask the questions. Be proactive. What'd you learn at school today? What happened today? How was your day? Simple questions, but try and keep that dialogue going. If they're not going to volunteer it, then be proactive and rather than waiting for them to come to you, and especially with Bible questions, rather than waiting for them to come to you with important Bible questions, be teaching it, be talking about it, be modeling it. As Paul said, put God first in your family.
Well, Kyle, thank you for that important topic. There's a lot of takeaways, whether this was for you, putting God first every day and making sure that you're not casting your tent near Sodom as Lot did, or as a husband or parent leading your family, that you make those choices. So thank you for joining us today. We hope that you've benefited from this. We also hope that you can like this podcast on our Facebook page or give us a rating on whatever platform you're listening to this and share it with your friends. Look forward to seeing you at the next episode. Thank you. Is there a Star Wars reference here? I don't know. I'm just sensing that you guys have not put in a Star Wars reference in a while. If Anakin had not hung around with Palpatine as long, then he wouldn't have gone to the dark side, or I don't know.
His tent was further away from the council on that one, right? I just watched those yesterday with James. We watched episode 3 and then episode 6. It was really great.